Hello everyone and welcome to our channel Frightening Tales. Today I told you about crime stories that make you more strong and provides entertainment. Let's get relaxed and begin. Title: The Body in Room 348. The corpse at the Elegante Hotel stymied the Beaumont, Texas, police. They could find no motive for the killing of popular oil and gas man Greg Flanagan and no explanation for how he had received his strange internal injuries. Bent on tracking down his killer, Flanagan's widow, Susie, turned to private investigator Ken Brennan, the subject of a previous Vanity Fair story. Once again, as Mark Bowden reports, it was Brennan's sleuthing that cracked the case. Greg Flanagan traveled light and lived tidy. After so many years on the road, he would leave his rolling suitcase open on the floor of his hotel room and use it as a drawer. Dirty clothes went on the closet floor. Shirts he wanted to keep unwrinkled hung above. Toiletries were in the pockets of a cloth folding case that hooked onto a towel rack in the bathroom. At the end of the day he would slide off his worn brown leather boots and line them up by the suitcase, drop his faded jeans to the floor, and put on lightweight cotton pajama bottoms. Most evenings he never left the room. He would crank up the air conditioner. He liked a cool room at night and sit on the bed, leaning back on two pillows propped against the headboard. Considerately, to avoid soiling the bedspread, he would lay out a clean white hand towel, on which he placed his ashtray, cigarette pack, lighter, BlackBerry, the TV remote, and a candy bar. He smoked and broke off candy bits while watching TV. This is where Greg was on the evening of Wednesday, September 15, 2010, in room 348 of the MCM Elegante Hotel, in Beaumont, Texas, lounging, smoking, snacking on a Reese's Crispy Crunchy bar, sipping root beer, and watching Iron Man 2. He missed the ending. Greg was accustomed to solitary nights. As a young man he had worked as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months at sea. In middle age he had reinvented himself as a landman, a familiar occupation in South Texas, easing the exploitation of mineral rights on private property for gas and oil companies. Slender, with a close-cropped white beard and the weathered skin of a lifelong outdoorsman, he had partnered with his brother, Michael, in a thriving oil land leasing business based in this small city east of Houston. Every Monday morning he would make the 2-hour drive in his pickup from Lafayette, Louisiana, heading west on Interstate 10 through scruffy Gulf Shore farmland broken only by cell phone towers, oil derricks, and billboards advertising motel chains, bayou restaurants, adult superstores, and other local attractions. It took him through the stink of the big ConocoPhillips refinery at Lake Charles, a forest of piping, giant tanks, and towering chimneys. The hotel was just off the Cloverleaf outside Beaumont. His company rented him a room in the cabana, a 3-story wing that wrapped around a small swimming pool framed by potted palms. That Wednesday night, watching his movie, Greg got an email from his wife, Susie, shortly after 7. Susie was using a computer program to file for a tax extension. After she reported her progress he wrote back, "You're doing good, babe." At some point during the loud, computer-generated showdown at the end of the film, amid all the fake violence, Greg was struck from nowhere with a very real and shattering blow. A blow so violent it would blind a man with pain. He managed to get off the bed and move toward the door before he fell, legs splayed, and face first. He was probably dead by the time his face hit the green rug. A natural causes thing. The following morning, Susie Flanagan called Greg's office. Husband and wife usually spoke every morning, but he hadn't called. He wasn't answering his phone. When he failed to turn up at the office, 2 of his co-workers drove over to the hotel and knocked on his door. There was no answer, so they got the hotel manager to open it. Their alarmed calls brought an ambulance and the Beaumont police. They found a middle-aged man dead on the rug, prone and doubled over, a spent cigarette cup delicately between 2 stiff fingers of his left hand. Room 348 was stuffy and exceptionally warm. The man's skin color had gone grayish-blue. There was a wet spot at the crotch of his blue pajamas, but that wasn't unusual. Detective Scott Apple showed up a little more than an hour later. He is a short and very fit man with graying hair that he wears combed straight up in spikes. He is all cop. His wife had been a cop, he met her on the job. He was one of the assault team leaders on the department's SWAT team. He is one of those men who never stop working. But there was little here to interest him. No sign of a break-in or struggle. Nothing disturbed in the room. No blood or obvious wounds. Flanagan's wallet was still in the back pocket of his jeans and had a stack of $100 bills in it, so robbery wasn't an issue. Those staying in nearby rooms had heard nothing. As Apple questioned the neighbors, he told them it was probably a natural causes thing. Sad. He poked around Flanagan's bags, looking mostly for pills, some clue to his collapse. There were none. Susie and Michael later told him that Greg never went to a doctor. He was a stubbornly independent man, suspicious of authority and unmoved by the modern passion for health and fitness. He did not exercise. He had chain-smoked his entire adult life and had the nagging cough to prove it. He neither drank nor ate to excess, but did both freely. It was easy to conclude that his choices had simply caught up with him. Susie was ready to believe it. She was shocked and grief-stricken, but she accepted that, for Greg, sudden death was a possibility. In fact, she took some solace in it. He had checked out on his own terms. Many times she had heard him remark, upon hearing of someone's dying suddenly, "Lucky bastard. That's how I want to go." And so he had. At the hotel, the police saw the death as routine. A photographer snapped pictures to make a record of the scene, and the body was driven by a transport service to the Jefferson County Medical Examiner for an autopsy. The only mystery here appeared to be medical, and it was likely a minor mystery at that. Dr. Tommy Brown had a time-tested method. It took him 45 minutes to conduct a post-mortem exam, inspecting a body inside and out, measuring and weighing organs, all the while describing what he found and noting the metrics that fleshed out the official form. He was all business, crisp, efficient, and confident. Brown was thin and bald on top and had a spray of unruly white hair on the sides that gave off a mad scientist vibe. He did everything fast, he even talked fast. He was a local character, part of the legal landscape in Jefferson County, and a respected one. Where death was concerned, in this corner of Texas, Dr. Tommy Brown's word was law. The circumstances of Greg Flanagan's death, as reported, were unremarkable. On the table before him was a 55-year-old Caucasian male who appeared to be in decent shape. After methodical inspection, the only marks Brown found on the body were a 1-inch abrasion on his left cheek, where his face had hit the rug, and, curiously, a half-inch laceration of his scrotum. This was interesting. The sac itself was swollen and discolored, and around the wound was a small amount of edema fluid. The bruising had spread up through the groin area and across the right hip. Something had hit him hard. The story his body told grew more intriguing. When Brown opened the front of the torso, he discovered a surprising amount of blood and extensive internal damage. A certain amount of partly digested food had been torn from his intestines. The doctor found small lacerations there, and on the stomach and liver, as well as 2 broken ribs and a hole in the right atrium of his heart. The condition of his insides reflected severe trauma. Flanagan had been beaten to death, or crushed. Brown concluded that the wound to his genitals likely had been caused by a hard kick. He had also taken a blow to the chest so severe it had caused lethal damage. He would have bled out in less than 30 seconds. On the official form, next to manner of death, Brown wrote, "Homicide. Whodunit?" When he got this surprising news, Detective Apple called Brown immediately for an explanation. The doctor told him that the man in 348 had suffered the kind of severe internal injuries he was more used to seeing in crash victims, or in someone found under a heavy fallen object. There are not that many murders in Beaumont. Greg's was one of 10 that year, which was about average. Most are not mysterious. Detective work was usually a matter of doing the obvious, interviewing the drunk boyfriend with gunpowder on his hands, or finding the neighborhood drug dealer who was owed money. A case like this was a once-in-a-career event. If you enjoy working a stubborn whodunit, which Apple does, then this one was an exciting challenge. But the problem with the hard cases is that they are indeed hard. Over the next weeks and months, Apple chased down every angle he could imagine to explain the death of Greg Flanagan. But about 6 months into it, he was stuck. The physical evidence didn't add up. Unless Greg had been beaten to death elsewhere, and his body had been returned to the room and carefully placed on the rug, nothing about the scene added up to a crime. How does a man get beaten so severely that ribs crack, inner organs tear, and the heart ruptures, all without significant damage to his torso? Other than the bruising and the cut at his crotch, Flanagan's outer body showed no signs of a beating. And how could such a rumble have taken place in the hotel room without a thing being toppled or even disturbed? Without anyone in adjacent rooms hearing a thing? And there was no answer to the all-important question, why? Greg appeared to have had no enemies. Apple talked a lot to Susie. She had been in her 20s, a singer in a rock band, when she met Greg. She clearly adored him. Susie was a delightfully offbeat Southern belle, buxom and pretty and warm and oh so deferential, but also, in that time-honored Southern way, stubborn as a tick. She was heartbroken and furious at the same time. Greg was the nicest man she had ever met. He was so nice she had married him twice, first as kids and then, after parting ways for a number of years, again in middle age. When Susie first called him again after that separation, he said, "I've been waiting for you to call." They had been married the second time for 15 years. His brother and co-workers said he had been universally liked in their company. His life at the Elegante rarely intersected with anyone else's. He went to his room early in the evening and usually stayed there by himself until morning. Greg had never been seen down at the bar. He did not socialize or drink a lot or pick up women. So this was not a drunk. This was not a philanderer or a man who got into fights. This was a decent, honorable, smart, and successful man whom people liked. The sort of man nobody would murder, yet somebody had. Through the fall and into the winter of 2010, Apple pursued a number of possibilities. Maintenance records showed that at some point early in the evening of his death, while cooking pre-packaged popcorn in the microwave, Greg had inadvertently blown an electrical circuit. The outage had affected the adjacent room, 349, and the rooms directly underneath. Greg had called the front desk to report the outage and confessed his role sheepishly to the man who had come up to reset the breaker. This led to two theories. The first involved sex. The Elegante maintenance man happened to have a rap sheet as a sex offender. Might the puncture wound to the scrotum and internal injuries have been caused by a long screwdriver, some sort of bizarre and kinky assault? Apple spent a lot of time talking to the maintenance man and looking into his background, but this theory never advanced beyond wild suspicion. The second theory involved a group of union electricians staying at the Elegante, a number of whom had been in the room next door, room 349, on the night Greg died. They were in town for an extended stay, doing a job for an oil company. At night, they tended to assemble in one another's rooms to drink. What if some of them had been partying next door when their electricity went out? Might one or more of them have knocked on Greg's door and, perhaps drunk and annoyed, exchanged words with and then assaulted him in the hallway? Could Greg, badly beaten, have returned to his room and then collapsed? Some of the electricians had been questioned on the day the body was found, but none of them said they had had any interaction with the man in 348. 9 days after Greg's death, Apple and a colleague returned to the third floor of the Cabana wing to question some of these same men again. Apple was wearing a hidden video camera. The men they encountered were friendly and appropriately curious. "What happened to that guy, anyway?" asked Lance Mueller, a sharp-featured man with dark, thinning hair dressed in a t-shirt and blue jeans. Mueller was the man registered in room 349, along with the roommate, Tim Steinmetz. "Hell, I don't know," Apple said, honestly. "That's what I'm trying to find out. It was almost like something fell on him or something. We're just trying to see if somebody heard something, or maybe if somebody knows somebody heard something, or maybe if somebody messed with him." Mueller and Steinmetz had nothing to offer. The two electricians said they thought they had heard the man in the next room coughing when they returned from the bar. Mueller seemed as confused as Apple was about the idea that something had crushed the man. "There's nothing in these rooms heavy enough," he said. Down the hall, they found three more of the electricians: Trent Pisano, Thomas Elkins, and Scott Hamilton. The men were friendly and tried to be helpful. One said that, when he had seen the body on a gurney in the elevator, he had first assumed they were caterers delivering a cake, or a big food tray. "That's a better thought," said Apple. Pisano said he had been in the room with Mueller and Steinmetz that night, but hadn't seen anything. The electricians handed over their driver's licenses and gave Apple their cell phone numbers. They would be in town for a few more months if anything came up. Happy to help. Weeks went by. Months went by. Apple worked any theory he could imagine. He considered the possibility that Susie had had her husband killed. He considered Michael Flanagan, Greg's brother and partner. There was nothing that even hinted at either person. Who doesn't love a mystery solved? It creates order from disorder, salves our ache for moral balance. An unsolved mystery is like a stone in your shoe. That is where the case of the body in room 348 was by the end of 2010. Scott Apple was stymied. Hoping to unearth something new, in November the family had put up a $50,000 reward. It produced nothing. Michael hired a private detective from Houston, a former FBI agent. Apple met with the man and reviewed the case. That was the last he saw of him. The matter of Greg Flanagan was bound for the cold files. It would be just another sad box of notes and evidence stored in the Jefferson County Courthouse. A fresh pair of eyes. Ken Brennan took Susie's call on the golf course. She was surprised that he picked up the phone himself. Ken Brennan speaking. "Oh, my God, you don't have a secretary?" Susie asked. She was flustered. The detective had answered on the first ring. She could barely get the story out: Greg's death, the coroner's finding, the dead end. He asked her to send him some files, he'd take a look. She said she had been feeling under the weather, but she would try to pull together what she had, pronto, and send it off to him. "Well," said Brennan, "you need to fucking take care of yourself." Like everything Brennan says, this came in a thick New York accent and a voice that sounds like it's strained through a cubic yard of gravel. It was a no bullshit "you better listen to me" command that was all the more startling because he had said something tender. It endeared him to Susie immediately. Brennan is a former Long Island cop and DEA special agent who now makes a good living as a private detective in Florida. That's why he was on the golf course in February. He is pushing 60, still solid, and always tan and stylish, in the South Florida manner. Blue-eyed, thick-necked, and ruggedly handsome, he is partial to lightweight short-sleeved shirts that show off his torso and big arms. He wears flashes of gold at the neck and wrist, and Irish rings on several fingers. Brennan's hair is mostly white now, and is combed straight back on the sides and straight up in the front in a low-key pompadour, cocky but dignified. Months earlier, not long after Greg was killed, a young lawyer friend, Kia Sherman, had told Susie and Michael about Brennan. Sharing Susie's frustration with the investigation, she had hit upon the strategy of filing a lawsuit against the hotel as a means of pursuing the probe privately. She had read an article by me in this magazine, The Case of the Vanishing Blonde, December 2010, detailing Brennan's remarkable success in resolving a 2005 cold case in Miami. Now, when the investigation seemed hopeless, Sherman brought up Brennan again. "If you want to do something," she urged Susie, You have got to call this guy, the one I told you about. Just find him. Brennan can be readily found on the internet and is asked to take more cases than he can handle. People come to him with unsolved murders and disappearances. He takes these people seriously and handles them gently. When he reads a file, he is looking for a case that intrigues him, but also one where he thinks he might be able to accomplish something. I ain't in the business of giving people false hopes, he says. The Flanagan case appealed to him because of the mystery, but also because there were so many avenues to explore: Greg's family and co-workers, hotel guests, the maintenance man. To Detective Apple, none of these leads seemed fresh anymore. To Brennan, they were all new and potentially promising. He knew that a fresh pair of eyes was perhaps the most valuable thing he brought to an investigation. Brennan visited Lafayette in April. He worked Susie over first, asking her a lot of hard questions about their relationship, about Greg's faithfulness, about insurance arrangements, satisfying himself that the wife had no clear motive to have him killed. "Let me ask you one more thing," said Brennan. "Was there anything about the crime scene that didn't seem right to you? That seemed off?" Susie told him that she was surprised that the room was so warm when Greg's co-workers entered it the following morning. Her husband liked to crank up the AC at night. Then Brennan went home and made arrangements for a second trip, to Beaumont. Apple came out to a sports bar late to meet him. The two men ate and talked. Brennan told Apple what he always tells the cops he meets in his work: "Listen, I'm not a maverick. I don't go doing things half-cocked. If I decide we're going to do this, we're going to do it as a team. There's nothing I'm going to do that you're not going to know about it, and there should be nothing that you're going to do that I don't know about. The one thing I won't do is fuck up your case. I've been doing this a long time. But I also know that you're the guy in charge here, so it's your case." Part of what was going on was Brennan checking out Apple. "I don't want to work with somebody I don't like," he told me. He prides himself on being able to read people very quickly. He liked the Beaumont detective. It was mutual. As Apple would put it later, Ken has good people skills. Dried toothpaste. The following morning, Apple picked up Brennan and they visited the hotel room, where Apple showed him the crime scene photos and the autopsy results, and reviewed what he had done over the previous 7 months. Brennan heard him out and then announced, "I think I know how this guy died. I think I know when he died. I think I know who killed him. And I think I know how we're going to catch him." "Come on," said Apple. "Hear me out. I'll tell you what I think, but first I got to call the guy's wife." He called Susie's cell phone. "Your husband, was he left or right-handed?" he asked. "He was right-handed." "And when he smoked, did he smoke with the cigarette in his left hand or his right hand?" "He always smoked with his right hand." "You sure?" "I'm positive." Brennan hung up and explained his conclusions to Apple. Susie had already told him how cold Greg kept his room. This helped fix the time of death. As Brennan saw it, the air conditioner had shut down with everything else when the circuit breaker blew. That time was known. Hotel records showed that their repairman had left Greg alive and well around 8:30 p.m. The movie resumed, and apparently Greg forgot to flip the AC back on. It would have taken a few minutes for the room to grow warm enough for him to notice, and by the time it had, he was dead. That's why he had been found in a warm room. As Brennan put it, in September, it's hot as fuck in Beaumont, Texas. The cigarette scotched the notion that Greg had been beaten severely somewhere else, perhaps even just out in the hall, and then returned to 348. A hallway scenario might explain why nothing had been disturbed in the room, but the cigarette ruled that out. There was no way Greg's attackers, returning him, would have added the fine touch of cupping one hand under his body and delicately placing a burning cigarette between his fingers. It was also unlikely, given the ruptured atrium, that Greg would have had time to return to the room after such a beating and calmly light up before keeling over. More likely, Greg had lit this cigarette himself before whatever happened to him happened. If Greg was right-handed, why was the cigarette found in his left hand? As Brennan pieced it together, examining the state of the room, Greg had gotten up from the bed and headed toward the door, shifting the cigarette to his left hand in order to grab the door handle with his right. Most popular. He's not listening to anyone or anything. Why Wall Street bent the knee to Trump on tariffs. Politics. He's not listening to anyone or anything. Why Wall Street bent the knee to Trump on tariffs. By Gabriel Sherman. 9 Perfect Strangers Season 2 takes a trippy trip to the Austrian Alps. Television. 9 Perfect Strangers Season 2 takes a trippy trip to the Austrian Alps. By Rebecca Ford. Are Elon Musk's Doge days over? Politics. Are Elon Musk's Doge days over? By Issy Lepowski. Advertisement. It was hard to see this making sense, but Brennan had learned to be patient. It was a mistake to let what you do not know race out ahead of what you do. A crime was a puzzle. If there was even one small piece that did not fit, the puzzle was incomplete. So he was willing to follow the evidence in unlikely directions. Even when the conclusions it suggested were absurd. Greg could not have been beaten to death in his room, the evidence suggested, and yet he had died there, and he had died quickly after sustaining his wounds. Somehow, that's what had happened. He didn't know yet how it had happened, but he was convinced that Greg had been quietly minding his own business just minutes, even seconds, before he was killed. This is what led to the electricians, who were close. Their room had been partly blacked out by the blown circuit at the same time Greg's had been. So, of all the scenarios Apple had considered, this was the one that made the most sense. The union guys may well have been drunk, and may have confronted Greg in the doorway of his room, exchanged words, and kicked him to death right there. He asked Apple if he had interviewed them. "Yeah, they were nice," said Apple. "See anything hinky?" No. "I'm sure if they were drinking they had to talk about it to each other," said Brennan. "So somebody knows about them. Probably one or two of their close friends or their co-workers are going to know about this." They next paid a visit to Dr. Brown. Ken wanted to know if the injuries Brown had seen might have been caused by a severe beating. They might have, the doctor said. The laceration of the scrotum could have been caused by a hard kick, especially if the assailant had been wearing steel-toed boots. The electricians next door wore construction boots. Brennan asked Apple to start interviewing men who had worked with the union electricians the previous summer. He returned home to continue inspecting the hotel's surveillance video. It was time-consuming work and not particularly helpful. He calls it looking to see the to and fro. The cameras showed Greg coming in from work that evening. They showed several of the electricians making trips to their vehicles in the parking lot. But there was nothing obviously suspicious. When Brennan returned to Beaumont, in late May, he and Apple went to see some of the co-workers who had not yet been interviewed. By this time the union electricians had been gone for 7 months. Apple's efforts with the co-workers had uncovered nothing, but Brennan was convinced it was worthwhile. Human nature being what it was, if any of the electricians knew something about Greg's death, word would have spread. So they made the rounds. Yes, most of the men had heard about the man who died in the Elegante Hotel. What a shame. Did anyone know yet what had happened to him? All of what these men knew was second or third hand or worse, and was predictably confused. As Brennan would remember it later, one of the crew foremen, a man named Aaron Bork, had heard something about a gun going off in a boarding house. No, Apple corrected him. That's not the same case. This was the one where a man got in a fight at the Elegante Hotel. Bork had heard nothing about that. As they drove away from Bork's house, Brennan said, "We need to go back to the hotel." "What are we going back there for?" Apple asked, noting that he and Ken had checked out the room thoroughly. "We're going to look for a bullet." In room 348 they began inspecting the floor, the furniture, the walls, everything. They were both working on their hands and knees, shining flashlights under furniture. They found nothing. Brennan was frustrated, because he was now convinced that somehow a gun had been involved. They were about to give up when he noticed an indentation in the wall alongside the closed door that led into the adjoining room. The indentation was a repair job. It appeared to be right where the handle of the door would hit the wall, typical hotel room wear and tear. But when he swung the door open, the knob and the dent didn't quite match. The doorknob touched the wall slightly to the right. "Let's take a look at the other side," Brennan suggested. When they got the hotel security guy to let them into room 349, there was no mistaking what they found on the wall there. Brennan stood alongside a small neat hole in the wall that had been patched with a daub of faintly pink filler that turned out to be dried toothpaste. He measured its height against his hip, then walked back to 348 and measured the indentation. They lined up. A bullet had gone through the wall. The small, neat hole in 349 marked its entry, the larger hole in 348, its exit. Beaumont's crime scene investigators carefully excavated both holes and shined a laser through. The trajectory pointed straight up to the bed where Greg had been sitting, smoking, eating candy, and watching his movie. Brennan said, "This motherfucker was shot." Dr. Brown was not convinced. He had examined the man's body from head to toe, cut him open, inspected his inner organs one by one, and reversed the expectations of the police. With precision and with the insight of years, he had determined that Greg Flanagan died not from natural causes but from a severe beating. Now they wanted to tell him that his careful and professional observations were wrong? That he had missed, of all things, a bullet wound. Brennan volunteered to do the talking. After he and Apple had found the bullet hole and traced the trajectory, the answer to the mystery of Greg's death was, he believed, clear. But in order to bring Greg's killer or killers to justice, they would have to get the coroner to rewrite his findings. You could not argue in court that a defendant had shot someone if the medical examiner's office had concluded that the victim had not been shot. Brown's office was a mess. Papers, files, books everywhere, every available surface was buried, even the floor. They cleared away space on 2 chairs to sit down, and when they mentioned they were working the Flanagan case, the doctor asked, "Oh, did you catch the guy that beat him up?" "No, we're not there yet," said Brennan, and he then started to explain what they had discovered, trying to approach the subject delicately. Brown quickly got the picture. "You're trying to tell me that this man was shot," he said. "I'm telling you he wasn't shot." He could see where this was heading, and he flatly refused to order the body exhumed. Exhumation is a pain in the ass. It is expensive, disturbing to the family, and a hell of a lot of work. And in this case, as it happens, it was impossible, since the body had been cremated. The ovens were hot enough to destroy metal fragments. "Listen, Doc," Brennan proposed, "let's just take out the photos from the autopsy and go through them and see what we can find." Brown humored them. As they looked through the photographs, passing them back and forth across the desk, Brennan pointed out things. "What about this here?" he said, indicating a spot of damage. "Yes, that's the liver." "And what about this here?" "Yes, that's the intestines." Brennan knew what he was looking at. The bullet had entered Greg's scrotum and torn up through him. The skin of the scrotum was soft and pliable, and it had folded over the entry wound, making it less obvious what it was. The internal injuries traced the bullet's fatal trajectory. Brennan asked, "Doc, could all of this damage have been done besides blunt force trauma? Could a bullet cause the same?" "Yes, it could, but that's not what happened here. This man was beaten." "Okay, Doc, but could it have?" Brennan found something in a photo that supported his argument. It looked like a track. "You could get the same thing from being beaten," Brown explained. Then they got to the heart. Brown passed the photo to the detectives. "Doc," Brennan said. "What?" "That's a bullet hole, document." Brown took the photo. "What?" Brennan pointed. "That's a fucking bullet hole." Brown explained that sometimes when a man is kicked or hit with a blunt object in the chest, it is the right atrium that normally bursts. "Doc, that's a fucking bullet hole." Brown looked again. "Yeah, that's a bullet hole." After a long moment he added, "The media is going to kill me on this. You've got a problem." Tim Steinmetz must have been feeling pretty okay about this meeting with the Texas cops. Getting called had been a shocker. It was more than 7 months since he and Lance Mueller had come home from the job in Beaumont. Now 2 cops from down there had come all the way to Wisconsin to see him and to question him about the guy who had died next door. It had been worrisome. He and Mueller had conferred about it beforehand by phone and made sure their stories were straight. Steinmetz met the detectives in an interview room at the Chippewa County Sheriff's Department, and, really, they could not have been nicer. Tim sat in a swivel chair on one side of a big wooden table, and they sat opposite him with their notebooks open and files handy. Very official. They thanked him for coming in. They assured him that this was routine. And they had walked him through the evening, asking a lot of questions, with Steinmetz answering diligently, trying to remember every detail, leaving out the part about the gun, of course, but the detectives had not pushed him at all. "You heard that the guy next door to you died?" asked the older one, the big man with the white hair combed straight up in front, Ken Brennan. "We did hear that," said Steinmetz. "But we really didn't know for sure what the hell was going on. We had no idea. We didn't hear no commotion next door, no banging, no nothing. That's why this is kind of weird." Brennan and Apple took notes, then Apple carefully wrote out Steinmetz's statement. "And that's it, huh?" the electrician asked. "That's it," said Apple. "You guys flew all the way here for that?" Brennan asked Steinmetz to go through the statement, read it out loud, and make any corrections he wanted. Steinmetz noticed that Apple had put down that he was an apprentice, so he changed that to journeyman. A few other little things. He initialed all the places where he made a change. Then they brought in a local cop to notarize the statement right there in front of him. So Steinmetz was feeling pretty good when he stood up to go. "Is that it?" he asked. "Hang on a second," said Brennan. His tone was different now, harsh. "It was, until you signed that statement. Now you've got a problem." "Oh.K," said Steinmetz, startled. He sat down again. "Now tell us what really happened," said Brennan. "Because we know what happened. Because now you're going to jail with him. Do you want to go to jail with Lance?" "Why am I going to go to jail with Lance?" "You just made a false police report, that's why," said Brennan. "Tim, we know what happened," said Apple, speaking more gently. "We know everything that happened down there. And I realize you are trying to be noble and protect a friend, but you are about to get your whole family in a bind, and it's not worth it. It's not worth it. So, just tell us what happened," said Brennan. Out came the whole story, corroborated later that same day, June 1, 2011, in an interview with Trent Pisano, who had been in 349 with them. Between the two accounts, the following scenario emerged: they had been drinking beer. Mueller asked Pisano to fetch a bottle of whiskey from his car, and to also bring up his pistol, a 9mm Ruger. When Pisano returned, Mueller took out the handgun and, to the other's alarm, started playing with it. He pointed it at Steinmetz, who dropped to the floor and cursed at him, and he was pointing it in Pisano's direction, at the foot of the bed, when it went off. Pisano thought for a second that he had been hit, but then turned to see a hole in the wall behind him. Mueller freaked out, they both said. Mueller bundled up the gun and took it back out to his car. When he returned, Pisano had left for his own room, disgusted. Mueller and Steinmetz went downstairs to the bar. Most popular. He's not listening to anyone or anything. Why Wall Street bent the knee to Trump on tariffs. Politics. He's not listening to anyone or anything. Why Wall Street bent the knee to Trump on tariffs. By Gabriel Sherman. 9 Perfect Strangers Season 2 takes a trippy trip to the Austrian Alps. Television. 9 Perfect Strangers Season 2 takes a trippy trip to the Austrian Alps. By Rebecca Ford. Are Elon Musk's Doge days over? Politics. Are Elon Musk's Doge days over? By Issy Lepowski. Steinmetz said they had not known for sure there was anyone staying in the room next door until, as he remembered, they heard someone in the room coughing very late, after midnight, when they came back from the bar. He held nothing back. Steinmetz's second statement, the truthful one, laid out the whole thing. It was good to get it off his chest. When he and Mueller had seen the police at room 348 the next morning, and had seen the gurney, they were disturbed, he told Brennan. I thought he had killed that guy. The only detail that didn't fit was this business of hearing a cough behind the closed door of room 348 when the two returned from the bar. For several reasons neither Brennan nor Apple was inclined to place much weight on it. If it was true, then Greg had survived the gunshot for far longer than the coroner believed possible, but it did not alter the cause of death. If anything, it made the electrician's failure to check on him or call for help all the more egregious. More likely is that they had heard Greg coughing in the room the previous evening. They had been in the room next to him that night too. They were drunk. Fixing the cough late on the night Greg died was the only shred of their story that contradicted the detectives' reconstruction, and they clung to it, even though it hardly mattered. Did anybody knock on the door next door, to check on the guy? Brennan asked. No, said Steinmetz. I always ask myself, if I was in a situation like this, what would I do, and I admit. He never finished the thought. The detectives had something else they wanted him to do. A long silence. Hey, Lance, what's up? Asked Steinmetz. He dialed Mueller on his cell phone. Apple and Brennan were recording the conversation. Not much, said Mueller. Just sitting around. Well, I just got back from down there. How did it go? Well, I told them the whole story. What had happened, that we were sticking to there, What's that? The story that we were sticking to, that we got home late that night, and the guy coughed and whatever. Right. And, Steinmetz began to hem and haw. And, I was fixin'. I was gonna leave there then, because your lawyer said it would be okay, right? Right. And when I left there they said, oh.k, tell us the truth. So, I told them the truth, what really happened. There was a long silence on the other end. About the gun going off and all that. Mueller asked. Yep. What did they say? Well, that I would be in trouble, if I didn't tell them. Another silence. So, what did they say? Not much. I don't know if they are going to get a hold of you, or Trent, or what the hell they're going to do. Mueller sighed heavily. Then he groaned. What did they mean by that? I mean, tell us the truth. Did they say anything about the gun prior to that or what? No. They just said they knew exactly what happened. Told me to stop fucking lying. They were pretty pissed. And then I told them exactly how everything went down, and what really and truly happened. Steinmetz suggested that Mueller call Apple right away. They probably are going to come and get your ass, now that they know the truth and everything. You should probably try to make some kind of effort, The guy, he died from the gunshot. Are you shitting me, Tim? No, I'm not. Oh, my God, are you kidding me? Are you serious right now? I'm serious as a heart attack, Lance. Mueller refused to believe it. For the next few minutes of the call, he went around and around with Steinmetz. His lawyer had obtained the autopsy report and assured him that the man had not died of a gunshot wound. The story had been all over the news. It doesn't make sense, he said. If there was a gunshot, if he was killed from, a firearm, they would have said something on the damn news. Mueller had worked hard to convince himself that the accidental gunshot and the death of the man in 348 were unrelated, and the autopsy report had confirmed it. It doesn't make sense. First the coroner ruled that it was a heart attack. Then they started saying that something fell on him. There's no way. There's absolutely no way that guy was killed by a bullet. He asked Steinmetz how he was doing. How am I doing? Steinmetz said. Not good. I need to drink some more beers. Mueller apparently applied the same remedy, because he later phoned Brennan, clearly intoxicated, and started trying to explain himself. He said he wanted to make a statement. You're drunk, Brennan told him. I suggest you call your fucking attorney. Case closed. Brennan was worried when the judge started reading the sentence. He had flown to Beaumont on October 29, 2012, to join Susie Flanagan and Scott Apple and a group of Greg's family and friends for the sentencing of Lance Mueller. The electrician had entered a no-contest plea to manslaughter. As Brennan remembered it, the judge began by saying that this whole tragedy might be seen just as a terrible accident. Oh, fuck, thought Brennan. Here it goes. Don't tell me this guy is going to get a year or something. But then the judge started cataloging the long list of willfully irresponsible choices that had led to this day. More like it, thought Brennan. The judge gave Mueller 10 years, half of what the law allowed. The apology Mueller offered in court, no matter how sincere, came way too late. There was his criminally irresponsible decision to drunkenly play with the gun. As Steinmetz had said, they had suspected from the start that the errant bullet had at least helped kill the man in room 348. Even a heart attack, which had been the first assumption as the police rolled his body out on a gurney, might have been triggered by the gunshot. Then, after the coroner had ruled that Greg had died of blunt force trauma, Mueller was happy to accept that something might have crushed him to death, even if it was hard to imagine what. Still, he had been worried enough about the gunshot. He had himself patched the hole with toothpaste. He had hidden the gun immediately in his car, then stashed it with a friend for the first few days after the incident, and had then handed it over to an attorney for safekeeping before he left Texas. What a huge mistake. If he had come forward at any time prior to Brennan and Apple solving the mystery, which had taken about 8 months, it is unlikely he would have been charged with manslaughter, much less have gone to jail. Mueller had gambled from the start that whatever connection he had to Greg's death would never be discovered. The odds in his favor were good, too. As it was, even after the connection was made, the county district attorney's office had been reluctant to prosecute the case as a felony. Brennan had turned that idea around. When he found out that the prosecutor might opt for a plea deal, he flew to Beaumont and joined a meeting between Apple and Paul Noyola, an investigator for the D.A.S. office. Noyola explained that accidental gun discharges in Texas were not uncommon, and that juries and judges tended to understand them, and that, well, the whole issue of accidental deaths was a fairly gray area of the Texas criminal code. In other words, the whole thing was looking like more of a hassle than a slam dunk. The private detective was indignant. He arranged to bring Susie Flanagan to Beaumont for a meeting with the assistant DA in charge of the case. Among other complications, the ADA told them, Mueller's gun was still locked in the lawyer's safe, and the lawyer was making noises about fighting efforts to have it turned over. I suggest you go down there with a search warrant and a fucking blowtorch and go get the fucking weapon, Brennan said. It's evidence of a capital crime. What the fuck are you talking about? Brennan was pretty worked up. Here's what he remembers saying. The victim was important to everybody here, he said, gesturing around the table. And we're not going to let this thing be brushed under the rug. Let somebody take a plea on this. This is not a fucking accident. An accident is when somebody comes in, has taken off their gun discharges, and, God forbid, somebody is hit. That's one thing. It's completely different when somebody fucking brings a gun that they shouldn't have into another fucking state, shit-faced drunk, fucking around with a gun. The people with him realize that something bad could happen. He discharges a round. Almost kills the guy he's with. And then he does kill somebody on the other side of the wall. He knows that's something that could happen, it's an occupied hotel. He doesn't even bother to knock on the door next door to see if anybody's hurt. And after that, his answer to the whole thing is to go get drunk some more in the fucking bar of the hotel? And then when he sees a body being taken out the next day, and he is 100% certain he killed somebody, he decides not to say anything about it but run to his attorney and leave the fucking weapon in a safe, and the fucking attorney doesn't say anything about it, either. You know what that is? That's fucking murder. So if you think we're going to forget about this fucking thing, think again. Because that ain't fucking happening. Brennan's anger can fill a room. After Mueller was sentenced, Brennan and Apple went out for a celebratory lunch. Brennan ordered a cocktail. Apple, who was on duty, didn't. They made plans to play a round of golf together. In the courtroom that day, Susie Flanagan had a chance to speak to Mueller directly. I have waited over 2 years to look you in the face, eye to eye, and simply have the chance to speak directly to you, she said. You would never have come forward with the truth. You murdered him. No, you didn't intentionally seek him out to murder him, but you murdered him, with every lie you told, with every intentional selfish deception, with every cover-up, over and over again. You saw his body taken out of the room in a body bag the next day. You knew you killed him. He meant nothing to you. Later, Susie told me that she watched Mueller's face as the sentence was pronounced, and that he had looked terribly shocked. That was good, she thought. He's shocked, but not as shocked as my husband was. That night in room 348, relaxing, smoking, watching Iron Man 2, Greg Flanagan could not have known what hit him in the moments before he died. Mueller knew exactly what was hitting him. You have met your match, said the small woman, staring across the courtroom at him, a study in controlled ferocity. I would have spent the rest of my life tracking you down. And I found you. Greg's murderer. I brought you to justice. The end. Another story. Title, True Crime by David Gran. In the southwest corner of Poland, far from any town or city, the Oder River curls sharply, creating a tiny inlet. The banks are matted with wild grass and shrouded by towering pine and oak trees. The only people who regularly trek to the area are fishermen, the inlet teems with perch and pike and sun bass. On a cold December day in 2000, 3 friends were casting there when one of them noticed something floating by the shore. At first, he thought it was a log, but as he drew closer he saw what looked like hair. The fisherman shouted to one of his friends, who poked the object with his rod. It was a dead body. The fisherman called the police, who carefully removed the corpse of a man from the water. A noose was around his neck, and his hands were bound behind his back. Part of the rope, which appeared to have been cut with a knife, had once connected his hands to his neck, binding the man in a backward cradle, an excruciating position. The slightest wiggle would have caused the noose to tighten further. There was no doubt that the man had been murdered. His body was clothed in only a sweatshirt and underwear, and it bore marks of torture. A pathologist determined that the victim had virtually no food in his intestines, which indicated that he had been starved for several days before he was killed. Initially, the police thought that he had been strangled and then dumped in the river, but an examination of fluids in his lungs revealed signs of drowning, which meant that he was probably still alive when he was dropped into the water. The victim, tall, with long dark hair and blue eyes, seemed to match the description of a 35-year-old businessman named Dariusz Janisowski, who had lived in the city of Wrocław, 60 miles away, and who had been reported missing by his wife nearly 4 weeks earlier. He had last been seen on November 13, leaving the small advertising firm that he owned, in downtown Wrocław. When the police summoned Janisowski's wife to see if she could identify the body, she was too distraught to look, and so Janisowski's mother did instead. She immediately recognized her son's flowing hair and the birthmark on his chest. The police launched a major investigation. Scuba divers plunged into the frigid river, looking for evidence. Forensic specialists combed the forest. Dozens of associates were questioned, and Janisowski's business records were examined. Nothing of note was found. Although Janisowski and his wife, who had wed 8 years earlier, had a brief period of trouble in their marriage, they had since reconciled and were about to adopt a child. He had no apparent debts or enemies, and no criminal record. Witnesses described him as a gentle man, an amateur guitarist who composed music for his rock band. He was not the kind of person who would provoke fights, his wife said. He wouldn't harm anybody. After 6 months, the investigation was dropped, because of an inability to find the perpetrator or perpetrators, as the prosecutor put it in his report. Janisowski's family hung a cross on an oak tree near where the body was found, one of the few reminders of what the Polish press dubbed the perfect crime. One afternoon in the fall of 2003, Jacek Rybalewski, a 38-year-old detective in the Wrocław Police Department, unlocked the safe in his office, where he stored his files, and removed a folder marked Janisowski. It was getting late, and most members of the department would soon be heading home, their thick wooden doors clapping shut, one after the other, in the long stone corridor of the fortress-like building, which the Germans had built in the early 20th century, when Wrocław was still part of Germany. The building has underground tunnels leading to the jail and the courthouse, across the street. Rybalewski, who preferred to work late at night, kept by his desk a coffee pot and a small refrigerator. That was about all he could squeeze into the cell-like room, which was decorated with wall-sized maps of Poland and with calendars of scantily clad women, which he took down when he had official visitors. The Janisowski case was 3 years old, and had been handed over to Rybalewski's unit by the local police who had conducted the original investigation. The unsolved murder was the coldest of cold cases, and Rybalewski was drawn to it. He was a tall, lumbering man with a pink, fleshy face and a burgeoning paunch. He wore ordinary slacks and a shirt to work, instead of a uniform, and there was a simplicity to his appearance, which he used to his advantage. People trusted him because they thought that they had no reason to fear him. Even his superiors joked that his cases must somehow solve themselves. Jacek is Jack in English, and Wróbel means sparrow, and so his colleagues called him Jack Sparrow, the name of the Johnny Depp character in Pirates of the Caribbean. Rybalewski liked to say in response, "I'm more of an eagle." After Rybalewski graduated from high school, in 1984, he began searching for his purpose in life, as he put it, working variously as a municipal clerk, a locksmith, a soldier, an aircraft mechanic, and, in defiance of the communist government, a union organizer allied with Solidarity. In 1994, 5 years after the communist regime collapsed, he joined the newly refashioned police force. Salaries for police officers in Poland were, and remain, dismal. A rookie earns only a few $1,000s a year, and Rybalewski had a wife and 2 children to support. Still, he had finally found a position that suited him. A man with a stark Catholic vision of good and evil, he relished chasing criminals, and after putting away his first murderer, he hung a pair of goat horns on his office wall, to symbolize the capture of his prey. During his few free hours, he studied psychology at a local university. He wanted to understand the criminal mind. Rybalewski had heard about the murder of Janisowski, but he was unfamiliar with the details, and he sat down at his desk to review the file. He knew that, in cold cases, the key to solving the crime is often an overlooked clue buried in the original file. He studied the pathologist's report and the photographs of the crime scene. The level of brutality, Wroblewski thought, suggested that the perpetrator, or perpetrators, had a deep grievance against Janisowski. Moreover, the virtual absence of clothing on Janisowski's battered body indicated that he had been stripped, in an attempt to humiliate him. There was no evidence of sexual abuse. According to Janisowski's wife, her husband always carried credit cards, but they had not been used after the crime, another indication that this was no mere robbery. Wroblewski read the various statements that had been given to the local police. The most revealing was from Janisowski's mother, who had worked as a bookkeeper in his advertising firm. On the day that her son disappeared, she stated, a man had called the office at around 9:30 a.m., looking for him. The caller made an urgent request. Could you make 3 signs, quite big ones, and the third one as big as a billboard, he asked. When she inquired further, he said, I will not talk to you about this, demanding again to speak to her son. She explained that he was out of the office, but she gave the caller Janisowski's cell phone number. The man hung up. He had not identified himself, and Janisowski's mother had not recognized his voice, though she thought that he sounded professional. During the conversation, she had heard noise in the background, a dull roar. Later, when her son showed up at the office, she asked him if the customer had called, and Janisowski replied that they had arranged to meet that afternoon. According to a receptionist in the building, who was the last known person to see Janisowski alive, he departed the office at around 4 o'clock. He left his car, a Peugeot, in the parking lot, which his family said was very unusual. Although he often met with customers away from the office, he habitually took his car. Investigators, upon checking phone records, discovered that the call to Janisowski's office had come from a phone booth down the street. This explained the background noise, Wroblewski thought. Records also indicated that, less than a minute after the call ended, someone at the same public phone had rung Janisowski's cell phone. Though the calls were suspicious, Wroblewski could not be certain that the caller was a perpetrator, just as he could not yet say how many assailants were involved in the crime. Janisowski was more than 6 feet tall and weighed some 200 pounds, and tying him up and disposing of his body may have required accomplices. The receptionist reported that when Janisowski left the office, she had seen 2 men seemingly trailing him, though she could not describe them in any detail. Whoever was behind the abduction, Wroblewski thought, had been extremely organized and shrewd. The mastermind, Wroblewski assumed it was a man, based on the caller's voice, must have studied Janisowski's business routine and known how to lure him out of his office and, possibly, into a car. Wroblewski pored over the materials, trying to find something more, yet he remained stymied. After several hours, he locked the file in his safe, but over the next several days and nights he took it out again and again. At one point, he realized that Janisowski's cell phone had never been found. Wroblewski decided to see if the phone could be traced, an unlikely possibility. Poland lagged behind other European countries in technological development, and its financially strapped police force was only beginning to adopt more sophisticated methods of tracking cellular and computer communications. Nevertheless, Wroblewski had taken a keen interest in these new techniques, and he began an elaborate search, with the help of the department's recently hired telecommunications specialist. Although Janisowski's telephone number had not been used since his disappearance, Wroblewski knew that cell phones often bear a serial number from the manufacturer, and his men contacted Janisowski's wife, who provided a receipt containing this information. To Wroblewski's astonishment, he and his colleagues soon found a match. A cell phone with the same serial number had been sold on Allegro, an internet auction site, 4 days after Janisowski disappeared. The seller had logged in as Chris B7, who, investigators learned, was a 30-year-old Polish intellectual named Krystian Bala. It seemed inconceivable that a murderer who had orchestrated such a well-planned crime would have sold the victim's cell phone on an internet auction site. Bala, Wroblewski realized, could have obtained it from someone else, or purchased it at a pawn shop, or even found it on the street. Bala had since moved abroad, and could not be easily reached, but as Wroblewski checked into his background he discovered that he had recently published a novel called Amok. Wroblewski obtained a copy, which had on the cover a surreal image of a goat, an ancient symbol of the devil. Like the works of the French novelist Michel Houellebecq, the book is sadistic, pornographic, and creepy. The main character, who narrates the story, is a bored Polish intellectual who, when not musing about philosophy, is drinking and having sex with women. Wroblewski, who read mostly history books, was shocked by the novel's contents, which were not only decadent but vehemently anti-church. He made note of the fact that the narrator murders a female lover for no reason. What had come over me? What the hell did I do? And conceals the act so well that he is never caught. Wroblewski was struck, in particular, by the killer's method. I tightened the noose around her neck. Wroblewski then noticed something else. The killer's name is Chris, the English version of the author's first name. It was also the name that Christian Bala had posted on the internet auction site. Wroblewski began to read the book more closely, a hardened cop turned literary detective. 4 years earlier, in the spring of 1999, Christian Bala sat in a cafe in Wrocław, wearing a three-piece suit. He was going to be filmed for a documentary called Young Money, about the new generation of businessmen in the suddenly freewheeling Polish capitalist system. Bala, who was then 26, had been chosen for the documentary because he had started an industrial cleaning business that used advanced machinery from the United States. Though Bala had dressed up for the occasion, he looked more like a brooding poet than like a businessman. He had dark, ruminative eyes and thick curly brown hair. Slender and sensitive looking, he was so handsome that his friends had nicknamed him Amour. He chain-smoked and spoke like a professor of philosophy, which is what he had trained, and still hoped, to become. I don't feel like a businessman, Bala later told the interviewer, adding that he had always dreamed of an academic career. He had been the equivalent of high school valedictorian and, as an undergraduate at the University of Wrocław, which he attended from 1992 to 1997, he was considered one of the brightest philosophy students. The night before an exam, while other students were cramming, he often stayed out drinking and carousing, only to show up the next morning, disheveled and hungover, and score the highest marks. One time, I went out with him and nearly died taking the exam, his close friend and former classmate Lothar Razinski, who now teaches philosophy at another university in Wrocław, recalls. Beata Sierraka, who was one of Bala's philosophy professors, says that he had a voracious appetite for learning and an inquisitive, rebellious mind. Bala, who often stayed with his parents in Kozienice, a provincial town outside Wrocław, began bringing home stacks of philosophy books, lining the hallways and filling the basement. Poland's philosophy departments had long been dominated by Marxism, which, like liberalism, is rooted in Enlightenment notions of reason and in the pursuit of universal truths. Bala, however, was drawn to the radical arguments of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who maintained that language, like a game of chess, is essentially a social activity. Bala often referred to Wittgenstein as my master. He also seized on Friedrich Nietzsche's notorious contention that there are no facts, only interpretations, and that truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. For Bala, such subversive ideas made particular sense after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, where language and facts had been wildly manipulated to create a false sense of history. The end of communism marked the death of one of the great meta-narratives, Bala later told me, paraphrasing the postmodernist Jean-François Lyotard. Bala once wrote in an email to a friend, "Read Wittgenstein and Nietzsche 20 times each." Bala's father, Stanislaw, who was a construction worker and a taxi driver, "I'm a simple, uneducated man," he says, was proud of his son's academic accomplishments. Still, he occasionally wanted to throw away Christian's books and force him to plant with me in the garden. Stanislas sometimes worked in France, and during the summer Christian frequently went with him to earn extra money for his studies. He would bring suitcases stuffed with books, Stanislas recalls. He would work all day and study through the night. I used to joke that he knew more about France from books than from seeing it. By then, Balla had become entranced by French postmodernists such as Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. He was particularly interested in Derrida's notion that not only is language too unstable to pinpoint any absolute truth, human identity itself is the malleable product of language. Balla wrote a thesis about Richard Rorty, the American philosopher, who famously declared, "The guise of convincing your peers is the very face of truth itself." Balla interpreted these thinkers idiosyncratically, pulling threads here and there, and often twisting and turning and distorting them, until he had braided them into his own radical philosophy. To amuse himself, he began constructing myths about himself: an adventure in Paris, a romance with a schoolmate, and tried to convince friends that they were true. He would tell these tall stories about himself, Raczynski says. If he told one person, and that person then told someone else, who told someone else, it became true. It existed in the language. Raczynski adds, Christian even had a term for it. He called it mythocreativity. Before long, friends had trouble distinguishing his real character from the one he had invented. In an email to a friend, Balla said, "If I ever write an autobiography, it will be full of myths." Balla cast himself as an enfant terrible who sought out what Foucault had called a limit experience. He wanted to push the boundaries of language and human existence, to break free of what he deemed to be the hypocritical and oppressive truths of Western society, including taboos on sex and drugs. Foucault himself was drawn to homosexual sadomasochism. Balla devoured the works of Georges Bataille, who vowed to brutally oppose all systems and who once contemplated carrying out human sacrifices, and William Burroughs, who swore to use language to rub out the word, and the Marquis de Sade, who demanded, "Oh man, is it for you to say what is good or what is evil?" Balla boasted about his drunken visits to brothels and his submission to temptations of the flesh. He told friends that he hated conventions and was capable of anything, and he insisted, "I will not live long, but I will live furiously." Some people found such proclamations juvenile, even ridiculous, others were mesmerized by them. There were legends that no woman could resist him, one friend recalled. Those closest to him regarded his tales simply as playful confabulations. Sayaraka, his former professor, says that Balla, in reality, was always kind, energetic, hard-working, and principled. His friend Raczynski says, Christian liked the idea of being this Nietzschean Superman, but anyone who knew him well realized that, as with his language games, he was just playing around. In 1995, Balla, belying his libertine posture, married his high school sweetheart, Stanislava, or Stasia, as he called her. Stasia, who had dropped out of high school and worked as a secretary, showed little interest in language or philosophy. Balla's mother opposed the marriage, believing Stasia was ill-suited for her son. "I thought he should at least wait until he had finished his studies," she says. But Balla insisted that he wanted to take care of Stasia, who had always loved him, and in 1997 their son Kacper was born. That year, Balla graduated from the university with the highest possible marks, and enrolled in its PhD program in philosophy. Although he received a full academic scholarship, he struggled to support his family, and soon left school to open his cleaning business. In the documentary on Poland's new generation of businessmen, Balla says, "Reality came and kicked me in the ass." With an air of resignation, he continues, "Once, I planned to paint graffiti on walls. Now I'm trying to wash it off." He was not a good businessman. Whenever money came in, colleagues say, instead of investing it in his company he spent it. By 2000, he had filed for bankruptcy. His marriage also collapsed. The basic problem was women, his wife later said. I knew that he was having an affair. After Stasia separated from him, he seemed despondent and left Poland, traveling to the United States, and later to Asia, where he taught English and scuba diving. He began to work intensively on Amok, which encapsulated all his philosophical obsessions. The story mirrors Crime and Punishment, in which Raskolnikov, convinced that he is a superior being who can deliver his own form of justice, murders a wretched pawnbroker. Wouldn't thousands of good deeds make up for one tiny little crime? Raskolnikov asks. If Raskolnikov is a Frankenstein's monster of modernity, then Chris, the protagonist of Amok, is a monster of postmodernity. In his view, not only is there no sacred being, God, if you only existed, you'd see how sperm looks on blood, there is also no truth, truth is being displaced by narrative. One character admits that he doesn't know which of his constructed personalities is real, and Chris says, I'm a good liar, because I believe in the lies myself. Unbound by any sense of truth, moral, scientific, historical, biographical, legal, Chris embarks on a grisly rampage. After his wife catches him having sex with her best friend and leaves him, Chris says that he has, at least, stripped her of her illusions. He sleeps with one woman after another, the sex ranging from numbing to sadomasochistic. Inverting convention, he lusts after ugly women, insisting that they are more real, more touchable, more alive. He drinks too much. He spews vulgarities, determined, as one character puts it, to pulverize the language, to screw it like no one else has ever screwed it. He mocks traditional philosophers and blasphemes the Catholic Church. In one scene, he gets drunk with a friend and steals from a church a statue of St. Anthony, the Egyptian saint who lived secluded in the desert, battling the temptations of the devil, and who fascinated Foucault. Foucault, describing how Saint Anthony had turned to the Bible to ward off the devil, only to encounter a bloody description of Jews slaughtering their enemies, writes that evil is not embodied in individuals but incorporated in words, and that even a book of salvation can open the gates to hell. Finally, Chris, repudiating what is considered the ultimate moral truth, kills his girlfriend Mary. I tighten the noose around her neck, holding her down with one hand, he says. With my other hand, I stabbed the knife below her left breast. Everything was covered in blood. He then ejaculates on her. In a perverse echo of Wittgenstein's notion that some actions defy language, Chris says of the killing, there was no noise, no words, no movement. Complete silence. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov confesses his sins and is punished for them, while being redeemed by the love of a woman named Sonia, who helps to guide him back toward a pre-modern Christian order. But Chris never removes what he calls his white gloves of silence, and he is never punished. Murder leaves no stain, he declares. And his wife, who, not coincidentally, is also named Sonia, never returns to him. The style and structure of Amok, which is derivative of many postmodern novels, reinforces the idea that truth is illusory. What is a novel, anyway, but a lie, a mythocreation? Bala's narrator often addresses the reader, reminding him that he is being seduced by a work of fiction. I am starting my story, Chris says. I must avoid boring you. In another typical flourish, Chris reveals that he is reading a book about the violent rebellion of a young author with a guilty conscience. In other words, the same story as Amok. Throughout the book, Bala plays with words in order to emphasize their slipperiness. The title of one chapter, Screwdriver, refers simultaneously to the tool, the cocktail, and Chris's sexual behavior. Even when Chris slaughters Mary, it feels like a language game. I pulled the knife and rope from underneath the bed, as if I were about to begin a children's fairy tale, Chris says. Then I started unwinding this fable of rope, and to make it more interesting I started to make a noose. It took me 2 million years. Bala finished the book toward the end of 2002. He had given Chris a biography similar to his own, blurring the boundary between author and narrator. He even posted sections of the book on a blog called Amok, and during discussions with readers he wrote comments under the name Chris, as if he were the character. After the book came out, in 2003, an interviewer asked him, "Some authors write only to release their Mr. Hyde, the dark side of their psyche, do you agree?" Bala joked in response, "I know what you are driving at, but I won't comment." It might turn out that Christian Bala is the creation of Chris. Not the other way around. Few bookstores in Poland carried Amok, in part because of the novel's shocking content, and those which did placed it on the highest shelves, out of the reach of children. The book has not been translated into English. On the internet, a couple of reviewers praised Amok. "We haven't had this kind of book in Polish literature," one wrote, adding that it was paralyzingly realistic, totally vulgar, full of paranoid and delirious images. Another called it a masterpiece of illusion. Yet most readers considered the book, as one major Polish newspaper put it, to be without literary merit. Even one of Bala's friends dismissed it as rubbish. When Sieraka, the philosophy professor, opened it, she was stunned by its crude language, which was the antithesis of the straightforward, intelligent style of the papers that Bala had written at the university. "Frankly, I found the book hard to read," she says. An ex-girlfriend of Bala's later said, "I was shocked by the book, because he never used those words. He never acted obscenely or vulgar toward me. Our sex life was normal." Many of Bala's friends believed that he wanted to do in his fiction what he never did in life, shatter every taboo. In the interview that Bala gave after Amok was published, he said, "I wrote the book not caring about any convention. A simple reader will find interesting only a few violent scenes with a graphic description of people having sex. But if someone really looks, he will see that these scenes are intended to awaken the reader and show how fucked up and impoverished and hypocritical this world is." By Bala's own estimate, Amok sold only a couple of thousand copies. But he was confident that it would eventually find its place among the great works of literature. "I'm truly convinced that one day my book will be appreciated," he said. History teaches that some works of art have to wait ages before they are recognized. In at least one respect, the book succeeded. Chris was so authentically creepy that it was hard not to believe that he was the product of a genuinely disturbed mind, and that he and the author were indeed indistinguishable. On Bala's website, readers described him and his work as grotesque, sexist, and psychopathic. During an internet conversation, in June of 2003, a friend told Bala that his book did not give the reader a good impression of him. When Bala assured her that the book was fiction, she insisted that Chris's musings had to be your thoughts. Bala became irritated. "Only a fool," he said, "would believe that." Detective Rybalewski underlined various passages as he studied Amok. At first glance, few details of Mary's murder resembled the killing of Genisowski. Most conspicuously, the victim in the novel is a woman, and the killer's longtime friend. Moreover, although Mary has a noose around her neck, she gets stabbed, with a Japanese knife, and Genisowski wasn't. One detail in the book, however, chilled Rybalewski. After the murder, Chris says, "I sell the Japanese knife on an internet auction." The similarity to the selling of Genisowski's cell phone on the internet, a detail that the police had never released to the public, seemed too extraordinary to be a coincidence. At one point in Amok, Chris intimates that he has also killed a man. When one of his girlfriends doubts his endless mytho-creations, he says, "Which story didn't you believe, that my radio station went bankrupt or that I killed a man who behaved inappropriately toward me 10 years ago?" He adds of the murder, "Everyone considers it a fable. Maybe it's better that way. Fuck. Sometimes I don't believe it myself." Rybalewski had never read about postmodernism or language games. For him, facts were as indissoluble as bullets. You either killed someone or you didn't. His job was to piece together a logical chain of evidence that revealed the irrefutable truth. But Rybalewski also believed that, In order to catch a killer, you had to understand the social and psychological forces that had formed him. And so, if Bala had murdered Janisowski or participated in the crime as Wroblewski now fully suspected, then Wroblewski, the empiricist, would have to become a postmodernist. To the surprise of members of his detective squad, Wroblewski made copies of the novel and handed them out. Everyone was assigned a chapter to interpret, to try to find any clues, any coded messages, any parallels with reality. Because Bala was living outside the country, Wroblewski warned his colleagues not to do anything that might alarm the author. Wroblewski knew that if Bala did not voluntarily return home to see his family, as he periodically did, it would be virtually impossible for the Polish police to apprehend him. At least for the moment, the police had to refrain from questioning Bala's family and friends. Instead, Wroblewski and his team combed public records and interrogated Bala's more distant associates, constructing a profile of the suspect, which they then compared with the profile of Chris in the novel. Wroblewski kept an unofficial scorecard. Both Bala and his literary creation were consumed by philosophy, had been abandoned by their wives, had a company go bankrupt, traveled around the world, and drank too much. Wroblewski discovered that Bala had once been detained by the police, and when he obtained the official report it was as if he had already read it. As Bala's friend Powell, who was detained with him, later testified in court, Christian came to me in the evening and had a bottle with him. We started drinking. Actually, we drank till dawn. Powell went on, the alcohol ran out, so we went to a store to buy another bottle. As we were returning from the shop we passed by a church, and this is when we had a very stupid idea. What idea did you have? The judge asked him. We went into the church and we saw St. Anthony's figure, and we took it. What for? The judge inquired. Well, we wanted a third person to drink with. Christian said afterward that we were crazy. In the novel, when the police catch Chris and his friend drinking beside the statue of St. Anthony, Chris says, we were threatened by prison. I was speechless. I do not feel like a criminal, but I became one. I had done much worse things in my life, and never suffered any consequences. Wroblewski began to describe Amok as a road map to a crime, but some authorities objected that he was pushing the investigation in a highly suspect direction. The police asked a criminal psychologist to analyze the character of Chris, in order to gain insight into Bala. The psychologist wrote in her report, the character of Chris is an egocentric man with great intellectual ambitions. He perceives himself as an intellectual with his own philosophy, based on his education and high IQ. His way of functioning shows features of psychopathic behavior. He is testing the limits to see if he can actually carry out his sadistic fantasies. He treats people with disrespect, considers them to be intellectually inferior to himself, uses manipulation to fulfill his own needs, and is determined to satiate his sexual desires in a hedonistic way. If such a character were real, a true living person, his personality could have been shaped by a highly unrealistic sense of his own worth. It could also be a result of psychological wounds and his insecurities as a man. Pathological relationships with his parents or unacceptable homosexual tendencies. The psychologist acknowledged the links between Bala and Chris, such as divorce and philosophical interests, but cautioned that such overlaps were common with novelists. And she warned, basing an analysis of the author on his fictional character would be a gross violation. Wroblewski knew that details in the novel did not qualify as evidence, they had to be corroborated independently. So far, though, he had only one piece of concrete evidence linking Bala to the victim, the cell phone. In February 2002, the Polish television program 997, which, like America's Most Wanted, solicits the public's help in solving crimes, 997 is the emergency telephone number in Poland, aired a segment devoted to Janisowski's murder. Afterward, the show posted on its website the latest news about the progress of the investigation, and asked for tips. Rybolovsky and his men carefully analyzed the responses. Over the years, hundreds of people had visited the website, from places as far away as Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Yet the police didn't turn up a single fruitful lead. When Rybolovsky and the telecommunications expert checked to see if Bala had purchased or sold any other items on the internet while logged on as Chris-B7, they made a curious discovery. On October 17, 2000, a month before Genisowski was kidnapped, Bala had clicked on the Allegro auction site for a police manual called Accidental, Suicidal, or Criminal Hanging. Hanging a mature, conscious, healthy, and physically fit person is very difficult even for several people, the manual stated, and described various ways that a noose might be tied. Bala did not purchase the book on Allegro, and it was unclear if he obtained it elsewhere, but that he was seeking such information was, at least to Rybolovsky, a sign of premeditation. Still, Rybolovsky knew that if he wanted to convict Bala of murder he would need more than the circumstantial evidence he had gathered, he would need a confession. Bala remained abroad, supporting himself by publishing articles in travel magazines, and by teaching English and scuba diving. In January of 2005, while visiting Micronesia, he sent an email to a friend, saying, "I'm writing this letter from paradise." Finally, that fall, Rybolovsky learned that Bala was coming home. At approximately 2:30 p.m., after leaving a drugstore at Legnica Street, in Kozienice, I was attacked by 3 men, Bala later wrote in a statement, describing what happened to him on September 5, 2005, shortly after he returned to his hometown. "One of them twisted my arms behind my back, another squeezed my throat so that I could not speak, and could barely breathe. Meanwhile, the third one handcuffed me." Bala said that his attackers were tall and muscular, with close-cropped hair, like skinheads. Without telling Bala who they were or what they wanted, they forced him into a dark green vehicle and slipped a black plastic bag over his head. "I couldn't see anything," Bala said. "They ordered me to lie face down on the floor." Bala said that his assailants continued to beat him, shouting, "You fucking prick. You motherfucker." He pleaded with them to leave him alone and not hurt him. Then he heard one of the men say on a cell phone, "Hi, boss. We got the shithead." "Yes, he's still alive." "So now what?" At the meeting point, the man continued, "And what about the money? Will we get it today?" Bala said he thought that, because he lived abroad and was known to be a writer, the men assumed that he was wealthy and were seeking a ransom. "I tried to explain to them that I didn't have money," Bala stated. The more he spoke, though, the more brutally they attacked him. Eventually, the car came to a stop, apparently in a wooded area. "We can dig a hole for this shit here and bury him," one of the men said. Bala struggled to breathe through the plastic bag. "I thought that this was going to be the last moment of my life, but suddenly they got back into the car and began driving again," he said. After a long time, the car came to another stop, and the men shoved him out of the car and into a building. "I didn't hear a door, but because there was no wind or sun I assumed that we had entered," Bala said. The men threatened to kill him if he didn't cooperate, then led him upstairs into a small room, where they stripped him, deprived him of food, beat him, and began to interrogate him. Only then, Bala said, did he realize that he was in police custody and had been brought in for questioning by a man called Jack Sparrow. "None of it happened," Rybolovsky later told me. "We used standard procedures and followed the letter of the law." According to Rybolovsky and other officers, they apprehended Bala by the drugstore without violence and drove him to police headquarters in Wrocław. Rybolovsky and Bala sat facing each other in the detective's cramped office. A light bulb overhead cast a faint glow, and Bala could see on the wall the goat horns that eerily resembled the image on the cover of his book. Bala appeared gentle and scholarly, yet Rybolovsky recalled how, in a muck, Chris says, "It's easier for people to imagine that Christ can turn urine into beer than that someone like me can send to hell some asshole smashed into a lump of ground meat." Wroblewski initially circled around the subject of the murder, trying to elicit offhand information about Bala's business and his relationships, and concealing what the police already knew about the crime, an interrogator's chief advantage. When Wroblewski did confront him about the killing, Bala looked dumbfounded. "I didn't know Dariusz Janisowski," he said. "I know nothing about the murder." Wroblewski pressed him about the curious details in a muck. Bala later told me, "It was insane. He treated the book as if it were my literal autobiography. He must have read the book 100 times. He knew it by heart." When Wroblewski mentioned several facts in the novel, such as the theft of the statue of St. Anthony, Bala acknowledged that he had drawn certain elements from his life. As Bala put it to me, "Sure, I'm guilty of that. Show me an author who doesn't do that." Wroblewski then played his trump card, the cell phone. How did Bala get hold of it? Bala said that he couldn't remember, it was 5 years ago. Then he said that he must have bought the phone at a pawn shop, as he had done several times in the past. He agreed to take a polygraph test. Wroblewski helped to prepare the questions for the examiner, who asked, "Just before Dariusz Janisowski lost his life, did you know this would happen? Were you the one who killed him? Do you know who actually murdered him? Did you know Janisowski? Were you in the place where Janisowski was held hostage?" Bala replied no to each question. Periodically, he seemed to slow his breathing, in the manner of a scuba diver. The examiner wondered if he was trying to manipulate the test. On some questions, the examiner suspected Bala of lying, but, overall, the results were inconclusive. In Poland, after a suspect is detained for 48 hours, the prosecutor in the case is required to present his evidence before a judge and charge the suspect, otherwise, the police must release him. The case against Bala remained weak. All Wroblewski and the police had was the cell phone, which Bala could have obtained, as he claimed, from a pawn shop, the sketchy results of a polygraph, a notoriously unreliable test, a book on hanging that Bala might not even have purchased, and clues possibly embedded in a novel. Wroblewski had no motive or confession. As a result, the authorities charged Bala only with selling stolen property, Janisowski's phone, and with paying a bribe in an unrelated business matter, which Wroblewski had uncovered during the course of his investigation. Wroblewski knew that neither charge would likely carry any jail time, and although Bala had to remain in the country and relinquish his passport, he was otherwise a free man. "I had spent 2 years trying to build a case, and I was watching it all collapse," Wroblewski recalled. Later, as he was flipping through Bala's passport, Wroblewski noticed stamps from Japan, South Korea, and the United States. He remembered that the website of the television show 997 had recorded page views from all of those countries, a fact that had baffled investigators. Why would anyone so far away be interested in a local Polish murder? Wroblewski compared the periods when Bala was in each country with the timing of the page views. The dates matched. Bala, meanwhile, was becoming a cause célèbre. As Wroblewski continued to investigate him for murder, Bala filed a formal grievance with the authorities, claiming that he had been kidnapped and tortured. When Bala told his friend Raczynski that he was being persecuted for his art, Raczynski was incredulous. "I figured that he was testing out some crazy idea for his next novel," he recalls. Soon after, Wroblewski questioned Raczynski about his friend. "That's when I realized that Christian was telling the truth," Raczynski says. Raczynski was shocked when Wroblewski began to grill him about Amok. "I told him that I recognized some details from real life, but that, to me, the book was a work of fiction," Raczynski says. "This was crazy. You cannot prosecute a man based on the novel he wrote." Beata Sierraka, Bala's former professor, who was also called in for questioning, says that she felt as if she were being interrogated by literary theorists. As outrage over the investigation mounted, one of Bala's girlfriends, Denise Reinhardt, set up a defense committee on his behalf. Reinhardt, an American theater director, met Bala while she was studying in Poland, in 2001, and they had subsequently traveled together to the United States and South Korea. Reinhardt solicited support over the internet, writing, "Chris Tien is the author of a fictional philosophical book called Amok. A lot of the language and content is strong and there are several metaphors that might be considered against the Catholic Church and Polish tradition." During his brutal interrogation they referenced his book numerous times, citing it as proof of his guilt. Dubbing the case the Sprawa Absurd the absurd matter, the committee contacted human rights organizations and international PEN. Before long, the Polish Justice Ministry was deluged with letters on Bala's behalf from around the world. One said, "Mr. Bala deserves his rights in accordance with Article 19 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights that guarantees the right to freedom of expression. We urge you to ensure there is an immediate and thorough investigation into his kidnapping and imprisonment and that all of those found responsible are brought to justice." Bala, writing in imperfect English, sent out frantic bulletins to the Defense Committee, which published them in a newsletter. In a bulletin on September 13, 2005, Bala warned that he was being spied on and said, "I want you to know that I will fight until the end." The next day, he said of Wroblewski and the police, "They have ruined my family life. We will never talk loud at home again. We will never use internet freely again. We will never make any phone calls not thinking about who is listening. My mother takes some pills to stay calm. Otherwise she would get insane, because of this absurd accusation. My old father smokes 50 cigs a day and I smoke 3 packs. We all sleep 3 to 4 hours daily and we are afraid of leaving a house. Every single bark of our little dog alerts us and we don't know what or who to expect. It's a terror. Quiet terror." The Polish authorities, meanwhile, had launched an internal investigation into Bala's allegations of mistreatment. In early 2006, after months of probing, the investigators declared that they had found no corroborating evidence. In this instance, they insisted, Bala's tale was indeed a mytho-creation. "He have infected you," Chris warns the reader at the beginning of Amok. "You will not be able to get free of me." Wroblewski remained haunted by one riddle in the novel, which, he believed, was crucial to solving the case. A character asks Chris, who was the one-eyed man among the blind. The phrase derives from Erasmus, 1469 to 1536, the Dutch theologian and classical scholar, who said, "In the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." Who in Amok, Wroblewski wondered, was the one-eyed man? And who were the blind men? In the novel's last line, Chris suddenly claims that he has solved the riddle, explaining, "This was the one killed by blind jealousy." But the sentence, with its strange lack of context, made little sense. One hypothesis based on Amok was that Bala had murdered Janisowski after beginning a homosexual affair with him. In the novel, after Chris's closest friend confesses that he is gay, Chris says that part of him wanted to strangle him with a rope and chop a hole in a frozen river and dump him there. Still, the theory seemed dubious. Wroblewski had thoroughly investigated Janisowski's background and there was no indication that he was gay. Another theory was that the murder was the culmination of Bala's twisted philosophy that he was a postmodern version of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, the two brilliant Chicago students who, in the 1920s, were so entranced by Nietzsche's ideas that they killed a 14-year-old boy to see if they could execute the perfect murder and become Superman. At their trial, in which they received life sentences, Clarence Darrow, the legendary defense attorney who represented them, said of Leopold, "Here is a boy at 16 or 17 becoming obsessed with these doctrines. It was not a casual bit of philosophy with him, it was his life." Darrow, trying to save the boys from the death penalty, concluded, "Is there any blame attached because somebody took Nietzsche's philosophy seriously and fashioned his life upon it? It is hardly fair to hang a 19-year-old boy for the philosophy that was taught him at the university." In Amok, Chris clearly aspires to be a postmodern Übermensch, speaking of his will to power and insisting that anyone who is unable to kill should not stay alive. Yet these sentiments did not fully explain the murder of the unknown man in the novel, who, Chris says, had behaved inappropriately toward him. Chris, alluding to what happened between them, says teasingly, maybe he didn't do anything significant, but the most vicious devil is in the details. If Bala's philosophy had justified, in his mind, a break from moral constraints, including the prohibition on murder, these passages suggested that there was still another motive, a deep personal connection to the victim, something that the brutality of the crime also indicated. With Bala unable to leave Poland, Wroblewski and his team began to question the suspect's closest friends and family. Many of those interrogated saw Bala positively a bright, interesting man, one of his former girlfriends said of him. Bala had recently received a reference from a past employer at an English instruction school in Poland, which described him as intelligent, inquisitive, and easy to get along with, and praised his keen sense of humor. The reference concluded, with no reservation, I highly recommend Christian Bala for any teaching position with children. Yet, as Wroblewski and his men deepened their search for the devil in the details, a darker picture of Bala's life began to emerge. The years 1999 and 2000, during which time his business and his marriage collapsed and Janisowski was murdered, had been especially troubled. A friend recalled that Bala once started to behave vulgarly and wanted to take his clothes off and show his manliness. The family babysitter described him as increasingly drunk and out of control. She said he constantly berated his wife, Stasia, shouting at her that she slept around and cheated on him. According to several people, after Bala and his wife separated, in 2000, he remained possessive of her. A friend, who called Bala an authoritarian type, said of him, he continuously controlled Stasia, and checked her phones. At a New Year's Eve party in 2000, just weeks after Janisowski's body was found, Bala thought a bartender was making advances toward his wife and, as one witness put it, went crazy. Bala screamed that he would take care of the bartender and that he had already dealt with such a guy. At the time, Stasia and her friends had dismissed his drunken outburst. Even so, it took 5 people to restrain Bala, as one of them told police, he was running amok. As Wroblewski and his men were trying to fix on a motive, other members of the squad stepped up their efforts to trace the 2 suspicious telephone calls that had been made to Janisowski's office and to his cell phone on the day he disappeared. The public telephone from which both calls were made was operated with a card. Each card was embedded with a unique number that registered with the phone company whenever it was used. Not long after Bala was released, the telecommunications expert on the Janisowski case was able to determine the number on the caller's card. Once the police had that information, officials could trace all the telephone numbers dialed with that same card. Over a 3-month period, 32 calls had been made. They included calls to Bala's parents, his girlfriend, his friends, and a business associate. The truth was becoming clearer and clearer, Wroblewski said. Wroblewski and his team soon uncovered another connection between the victim and the suspect. Malgorzata Drozdil, a friend of Stasia's, told the police that in the summer of 2000 she had gone with Stasia to a nightclub called Crazy Horse, in Wrocław. While Drozdil was dancing, she saw Stasia talking to a man with long hair and bright blue eyes. She recognized him from around town. His name was Dariusz Janisowski. Wroblewski had one last person to question, Stasia. But she had steadfastly refused to cooperate. Perhaps she was afraid of her ex-husband. Perhaps she believed Bala's claim that he was being persecuted by the police. Or perhaps she dreaded the idea of one day telling her son that she had betrayed his father. Wroblewski and his men approached Stasia again, this time showing her sections of Amok, which was published after she and Bala had split up, and which she had never looked at closely. According to Polish authorities, Stasia examined passages involving Chris's wife, Sonia, and was so disturbed by the characters' similarities to her that she finally agreed to talk. She confirmed that she had met Janisowski at Crazy Horse. I had ordered French fries, and I asked a man next to the bar whether the French fries were ready, Stasia recalled. That man was Darius. They spent the entire night talking, she said, and Janisowski gave her his phone number. Later, they went on a date and checked into a motel. But before anything happened, she said, Janisowski admitted that he was married, and she left. Since I know what it's like to be a wife whose husband betrays her, I didn't want to do that to another woman, Stasia said. The difficulties in Janisowski's marriage soon ended, and he and Stasia never went out together again. Several weeks after her date with Janisowski, Stasia said, Bala showed up at her place in a drunken fury, demanding that she admit to having an affair with Janisowski. He broke down the front door and struck her. He shouted that he had hired a private detective and knew everything. He also mentioned that he had visited Darius' office, and described it to me, Stasia recalled. Then he said he knew which hotel we went to and what room we were in. Later, when she learned that Janisowski had disappeared, Stasia said, she asked Bala if he had anything to do with it, and he said no. She did not pursue the matter, believing that Bala, for all his tumultuous behavior, was incapable of murder. For the first time, Rybalewski thought he understood the last line of Amok, this was the one killed by blind jealousy. Spectators flooded into the courtroom in Wrocław on February 22, 2007, the first day of Bala's trial. There were philosophers, who argued with each other over the consequences of postmodernism, young lawyers, who wanted to learn about the police department's new investigative techniques, and reporters, who chronicled every tantalizing detail. Killing doesn't make much of an impression in the 21st century, but allegedly killing and then writing about it in a novel is front-page news, a front-page article in Angora, a weekly based in Lodz, declared. The judge, Lydia Hojanska, sat at the head of the courtroom, beneath an emblem of the white Polish eagle. In accordance with Polish law, the presiding judge, along with another judge and 3 citizens, acted as the jury. The defense and the prosecution sat at 2 unadorned wooden tables. Next to the prosecutors were Janisowski's widow and his parents, his mother holding a picture of her son. The public congregated in the back of the room, and in the last row was a stout, nervous woman with short red hair, who looked as if her own life were at stake. It was Bala's mother, Teresa. His father was too distraught to attend. Everyone's attention, it seemed, was directed toward a zoo-like cage near the center of the courtroom. It was almost 9 feet high and 20 feet long, and had thick metal bars. Standing in the middle of it, wearing a suit and peering out calmly through his spectacles, was Christian Bala. He faced up to 25 years in prison. A trial is predicated on the idea that truth is obtainable. Yet it is also, as the writer Janet Malcolm has noted, a struggle between 2 competing narratives, and the story that can best withstand the attrition of the rules of evidence is the story that wins. In this case, the prosecution's narrative resembled that of Amok. Bala, like his alter ego Chris, was a depraved hedonist, who, unbound by any sense of moral compunction, had murdered someone in a fit of jealous rage. The prosecution introduced files from Bala's computer, which Rybalewski and the police had seized during a raid of his parents' house. In one file, which had to be accessed with the password Amok, Bala catalogued, in graphic detail, sexual encounters with more than 70 women. The list included his wife, Stasia, a divorced cousin, who was older and plump, the mother of a friend, described as old ass, hardcore action, and a Russian whore in an old car. The prosecution also presented emails in which Bala sounded unmistakably like Chris, using the same vulgar or arcane words, such as joy juices and Madame Melancholy. In an angry email to Stasia, Bala wrote, "Life is not only screwing, darling," which echoed Chris's exclamation, "Fucking is not the end of the world, Mary." A psychologist testified that every author puts some part of his personality into his artistic creation, and that Chris and the defendant shared sadistic qualities. During all this, Bala sat in the cage, taking notes on the proceedings or looking curiously out at the crowd. At times, he seemed to call into question the premise that the truth can be discerned. Under Polish law, the defendant can ask questions directly of the witnesses, and Bala eagerly did so, his professorial inquiries often phrased to reveal the darity and instability of their testimony. When a former girlfriend testified that Bala once went out on her balcony drunk and acted as if he were on the verge of committing suicide, he asked her if her words might have multiple interpretations. "Could we just say that this is a matter of semantics, a misuse of the word suicide?" he said. But, as the trial wore on and the evidence mounted against him, the postmodernist sounded increasingly like an empiricist, a man desperately looking to show gaps in the prosecution's chain of evidence. Bala noted that no one had seen him kidnap Janisowski, or kill him, or dump his body. "I'd like to say that I never met Darius, and there is not a single witness who would confirm that I did so," Bala said. He complained that the prosecution was taking random incidents in his personal life and weaving them into a story that no longer resembled reality. The prosecutors were constructing a mythocreation or, as Bala's defense attorney put it to me, the plot of a novel. According to the defense, the police and the media had been seduced by the most alluring story rather than by the truth. Stories about the case had appeared under headlines such as "Truth Stranger Than Fiction" and "Murder," he wrote. Bala had long subscribed to the postmodernist notion of the death of the author, that an author has no more access to the meaning of his literary work than anyone else. Yet, as the prosecution presented to the jury potentially incriminating details from Amok, Bala complained that his novel was being misinterpreted. He insisted that the murder of Mary was simply a symbol of the destruction of philosophy, and he made one last attempt to assert authorial control. As he later put it to me, "I'm the fucking author. I know what I meant." In early September, the case went to the jury. Bala never took the stand, but in a statement he said, "I do believe the court will make the right decision and absolve me of all the charges." Rybolovsky, who had been promoted to inspector, showed up in court, hoping to hear the verdict. "Even when you're sure of the facts, you wonder if someone else will see them the same way you do," he told me. At last, the judges and jurors filed back into the courtroom. Bala's mother waited anxiously. She had never read Amok, which contains a scene of Chris fantasizing about raping his mother. "I started to read the book, but it was too hard," she told me. "If someone else had written the book, maybe I would have read it, but I'm his mother." Bala's father appeared in the courtroom for the first time. He had read the novel, and though he had trouble understanding parts of it, he thought it was an important work of literature. "You can read it 10, 20 times, and each time discover something new in it," he said. On his copy, Bala had written an inscription to both his parents. It said, "Thank you for your forgiveness of all my sins." As Judge Hojanska read the verdict, Bala stood perfectly straight and still. Then came the one unmistakable word, "guilty." The gray cinder block prison in Wrocław looks like a relic of the Soviet era. After I slipped my visitor's pass through a tiny hole in the wall, a disembodied voice ordered me to the front of the building, where a solid gate swung open and a guard emerged, blinking in the sunlight. The guard waved me inside as the gate slammed shut behind us. After being searched, I was led through several dank interlocking chambers and into a small visitor's room with dingy wooden tables and chairs. Conditions in Polish prisons are notorious. Because of overcrowding, as many as 7 people are often kept in a single cell. In 2004, prison inmates in Wrocław staged a 3-day hunger strike to protest overcrowding, poor food, and insufficient medical care. Violence is also a problem. Only a few days before I arrived, I was told, a visitor had been stabbed to death by an inmate. In the corner of the visitor's room was a slender, handsome man with wire-rimmed glasses and a navy blue artist's smock over a t-shirt that said University of Wisconsin. He was holding a book and looked like an American student abroad, and it took me a moment to realize that I was staring at Christian Bala. "I'm glad you could come," he said as he shook my hand, leading me to one of the tables. This whole thing is farce, like something out of Kafka. He spoke clear English but with a heavy accent, so that his SES sounded like ZS. Sitting down, he leaned across the table, and I could see that his cheeks were drawn, he had dark circles around his eyes, and his curly hair was standing up in front, as if he had been anxiously running his fingers through it. "I am being sentenced to prison for 25 years for writing a book, he said. "It is ridiculous. It is bullshit. Excuse my language, but that is what it is. Look, I wrote a novel, a crazy novel. Is the book vulgar? Yes. Is it obscene? Yes. Is it bawdy? Yes. Is it offensive? Yes. I intended it to be. This was a work of provocation." He paused, searching for an example, then added, "I wrote, for instance, that it would be easier for Christ to come out of a woman's womb than for me." He stopped, catching himself. "I mean, for the narrator to fuck her. You see, this is supposed to offend." He went on, "What is happening to me is like what happened to Salman Rushdie." As he spoke, he placed the book that he was carrying on the table. It was a worn, battered copy of Amok. When I asked Bala about the evidence against him, such as the cell phone and the calling card, he sounded evasive and, at times, conspiratorial. "The calling card is not mine," he said. "Someone is trying to set me up. I don't know who yet, but someone is out to destroy me." His hand touched mine. "Don't you see what they are doing? They are constructing this reality and forcing me to live inside it." He said that he had filed an appeal, which cited logical and factual inconsistencies in the trial. For instance, one medical examiner said that Genisowski had drowned, whereas another insisted that he had died of strangulation. The judge herself had admitted that she was not sure if Bala had carried out the crime alone or with an accomplice. When I asked him about Amok, Bala became animated and gave direct and detailed answers. "The thesis of the book is not my personal thesis," he said. "I'm not an anti-feminist. I'm not a chauvinist. I'm not heartless. Chris, in many places, is my anti-hero." Several times, he pointed to my pad and said, "Put this down or this is important." As he watched me taking notes, he said, with a hint of awe, "You see how crazy this is? You are here writing a story about a story I made up about a murder that never happened." On virtually every page of his copy of Amok, he had underlined passages and scribbled notations in the margins. Later, he showed me several scraps of paper on which he had drawn elaborate diagrams revealing his literary influences. It was clear that, in prison, he had become even more consumed by the book. "I sometimes read pages aloud to my cellmates," he said. One question that was never answered at the trial still hovered over the case: why would someone commit a murder and then write about it in a novel that would help to get him caught? In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov speculates that even the smartest criminal makes mistakes, because he experiences at the moment of the crime a sort of failure of will and reason, which are replaced by a phenomenal, childish thoughtlessness, just at the moment when reason and prudence are most necessary. Amok, however, had been published 3 years after the murder. If Bala was guilty of murder, the cause was not a failure of will and reason but, rather, an excess of both. Some observers wondered if Bala had wanted to get caught, or, at least, to unburden himself. In Amok, Chris speaks of having a guilty conscience and of his desire to remove his white gloves of silence. Though Bala maintained his innocence, it was possible to read the novel as a kind of confession. Rybolovsky and the authorities, who believed that Bala's greatest desire was to attain literary immortality, saw his crime and his writing as indivisible. At the trial, Genisowski's widow pleaded with the press to stop making Bala out to be an artist rather than a murderer. Since his arrest, Amok had become a sensation in Poland, selling out at virtually every bookstore. There's going to be a new edition coming out with an afterword about the trial and all the events that have happened, Bala told me excitedly. Other countries are interested in publishing it as well. Flipping through the pages of his own copy, he added, "There's never been a book quite like this." As we spoke, he seemed far less interested in the idea of the perfect crime than he was in the perfect story, which, in his definition, pushed past the boundaries of aesthetics and reality and morality charted by his literary forebears. "You know, I'm working on a sequel to Amok," he said, his eyes lighting up. "It's called The Lyric." He repeated the word several times. "It's a pun. It means lyrics, as in a story, or delirium." He explained that he had started the new book before he was arrested, but that the police had seized his computer, which contained his only copy. He was trying to get the files back. "The authorities told me that they had found in the computer evidence that Bala was collecting information on Stasia's new boyfriend, Harry. Single, 34 years old, his mom died when he was 8, Bala had written. Apparently works at the railway company, probably as a train driver, but I'm not sure." Rybalewski and the authorities suspected that Harry might be Bala's next target. After Bala had learned that Harry visited an internet chat room, he had posted a message at the site, under an assumed name, saying, "Sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for Harry. Does anyone know him from Khajenow?" Bala told me that he hoped to complete his second novel after the appeals court made its ruling. In fact, several weeks after we spoke, the court, to the disbelief of many, annulled the original verdict. Although the appeals panel found an undoubted connection between Bala and the murder, it concluded that there were still gaps in the logical chain of evidence, such as the medical examiner's conflicting testimony, which needed to be resolved. The panel refused to release Bala from prison, but ordered a new trial, which is scheduled to begin this spring. Bala insisted that, no matter what happened, he would finish The Lyric. He glanced at the guards, as if afraid they might hear him, then leaned forward and whispered, "This book is going to be even more shocking." Diamond sued. The end.